Hello, everybody. I am going to be talking about one of my most favorite things to talk about, the Myers-Briggs type indicator. I use it extensively in my practice as a jumping off place for beginning to explore a person's true essence, right? So, the person we were wired to be way back when, before the world started to get a hold of us and tell us how to be, what to do, where to go, how to work, how to think, all those kinds of things, some of which is helpful, right? Let me shut this little window down, but a lot of which isn't, a lot of which is very restrictive and works against what we really need to be healthy, happy, and whole in the world. And so, because the Myers-Briggs is so incredibly fascinating, vast, complex in many ways, at least the theories around it are, it's impossible to fully encompass all of Myers-Briggs and Myers-Briggs theory and Myers-Briggs preference types and such into one Facebook Live. So what I've decided to do is to start a series of different lives and podcasts and things around type and preferences and how preferences show up in different sorts of ways and different sorts of environments, whether it's parent-child interactions or needs for closeness and that sort of thing, because it's absolutely fascinating. And I'll tell you, I apologize, I'm kind of just watching technology a little bit to try to stay connected with people. But I'll tell you that one of the things that I am not only experiencing myself, but seeing happening all the time for lots and lots of people right now, that we're all home working, right? We're in the midst of this pandemic and we're working, is that it is absolutely 100% requiring each and every one of us to get out of our comfort zone. The old proverb saying that says, pain is inevitable, but growth is optional, right? We have all been plunged, and everywhere around the world have we been plunged into a space where resorting to our comfort zone just doesn't work quite the same way that it does. Everybody's working from home. Kids are all working from home as well, which work for them is school. So it just felt really important, at least for today, to start out by beginning to talk a little bit about preference type, and in particular, how it shows up in different kinds of work styles. And I feel like this is such an important place to dive in because, so many parents right now are juggling just incredible demands on their time. They are wearing lots of hats. They're being parents, they're running a house, they are being educators to their children, they're homeschooling, they're being partners. By the time the end of the day shows up, there's nothing left in the gas tank. But what I also know is happening is that a lot of people who run businesses, managers and bosses, and really anybody who runs a group or a team of people, and that might be a family, could be a business group, but any person that's responsible for leadership or management of a group of people, you are probably very likely seeing a lot of this particular preference pair come out in terms of the work styles at home, routines, the way kids get motivated to work and not. So I thought today what I would start is by looking at preference styles in terms of work styles, the sweet spot for each preference pair, kind of the way, what you might notice from them, the kind of environment that they need to really thrive. And rest assured that this is just one aspect of personality type, right? So although I'm going to give you some little tools and tips and things that you'll be able to absolutely take and start implementing even today, it's only just a beginning. For those of you who have taken your Myers-Briggs type before, I would absolutely encourage you to just kind of reflect on what I'm going to share with you today and see if that feels true and see if it doesn't. One of the things that happens a lot is that when I start to work with someone around their Myers-Briggs type, that they come in and they have a sense of type already, whether they've taken the Myers-Briggs back in a psychology class or for a job or just for fun, right? There's so many online tests and assessments right now out there that it's very rare for me to begin working with someone who doesn't have some sense of Myers-Briggs type. But what happens is that I would say the majority of the time, and I would say up to 75% of the time, that someone comes in having a sense of their type, unless they've worked with certified administrators of the test and they've had the results verified and all that stuff. Most of the time, 75% of the time, the results are inaccurate. And only 25% of the time, when someone comes to me for some coaching or some therapy and we're working through Myers-Briggs type, only about 25% of the time what they actually score on the assessment is actually congruent with true type. Now, Myers-Briggs folks themselves, the industry themselves, they believe as well that there is an error of margin. There's that 25% of the times they say statistically somebody takes the assessment, that the results, true results, are actually not reflective of what they scored. I think it's the opposite. I think only 25% of the time it's true. And there's lots and lots of reasons for that, which I would be more than happy to get into and will in another podcast and Facebook Live. But let me just say for now that the reason why that happens, the reason why people get mistyped, is because we all have a defense system. We all have an Enneagram, which is just another system of personality typology. That is, we all have this defense system that's reflected in our Enneagram type. And it's absolutely impossible to take the Myers-Briggs without that part of us answering some of the questions. It's just not going to happen. So no matter how much we try to, use a certain set of criteria to answer the questions when we're taking Myers-Briggs, it's just not validly possible for us to score accurately on the test, which is why it's really important to take these Myers-Briggs assessments and get your results verified by someone who is a competent certified administrator. So more on that at another time, but I want to go ahead and dive back into the basic understanding of personality type, because one of the most powerful things is that as each of us are walking around in the world, we are interpreting absolutely every single experience, every single behavior that we see from another person, outside of ourselves, within ourselves. We are filtering each and every one of these experiences through our own preference. So oftentimes, there's a way that other people or other ways of being or other ways of existing, they get judged or interpreted as negative or wrong because we are interacting against the backdrop of our own preference. For example, at work, how this might show up is that you might have one person who really wants to double check to make sure, say, figures in a report or a project are accurate, and another person might call them a stickler for details or overly controlling, when in fact it has nothing to do with being a stickler or controlling. It's just simply a personality preference style. And so we might experience a particular characteristic or trait or lack of it in another person as a negativity or have judgment or bias towards that. And what I often find happens is that in those places when we are experiencing a particular aspect about someone else or lack of aspect, that we might actually be projecting something about ourselves onto that other person. So learning about type is incredibly powerful for so many reasons, in so many aspects. A lot of times I do some coaching with couples who are moving into a relationship or a marriage, and they want to learn about themselves and each other. I work with parents who are deciding to have a child or have children who are difficult. And the more we can learn about type, and especially starting with our own type, the more we're going to be able to show up and support type in others, whether it's our employees, our teammates, our children, our partners. So there's a lot of value. What I'm going to share with you today, like I said, is one tiny, tiny aspect of Myers-Briggs type personality. But it's information for you to take for some self-awareness, for perhaps some discussion and feedback, whether it's among colleagues, work teams, families. And so, as always, please ask questions as I'm going along. You can always email me or drop me a comment, but I'm really excited to bring this to you. So, one of the things about type, right, is that each of the preference pairs stands for something different. So we have the extroversion and the introversion. And what that particular preference pair refers to is energy. So how do we draw our energy? Where do we get it? How do we get energized? And where does our energy get drained? Extroversion and introversion has absolutely nothing to do about people. Do I like people? Am I social? I hear all the time, I must be an extrovert because I like to see people. I like to be around people. That has absolutely nothing to do with extroversion and introversion. In fact, I think this is probably one of the preference pairs that is most misunderstood and most mistyped. The next preference pair is the sensing and the intuition. And what this preference pair talks about is how we take information in. So basically, how do we learn? Sensors tend to learn on a very concrete, fact basis kind of deal, right? So what they can see, hear, taste, touch, smell, it's got to be real. Whereas intuitives, people with an intuition preference, they tend to take information in through almost like a sixth sense. So these are the folks who say things like, well, I can't really tell you how I know this, but I just know this is true. And more often than not, it's true. They can't give you facts. They can't connect dots as to why they got there. But they have a different way of taking in information and paying attention in the world. The next preference pair, the thinking and the feeling, this preference pair has nothing to do with feelings or emotions because even thinkers have feelings and even feelers think. What thinking and feeling talks about is the ability to make decisions. What criteria are decisions made upon, right? So thinkers tend to make decisions based on more logic, rationale, reason. Thinkers, the way they feel rewarded at work is did we get the job done? It doesn't matter how many people we left behind. And feelers, on the other hand, they have a preference for making decisions based on values and people, other people. So the way that feelers often make decisions is how is this going to impact me? How is this going to impact another person? So their reward at work is, yes, from getting the work done, but also bringing everybody along. So it's nothing to do with feelings and emotions. It's about how we make decisions and the criteria we use to do that. And then the last preference pair, the judging and the perceiving. What this preference pair talks about is how we organize in the world. So judgers tend to be a little more scheduled, a little more planned, a little more structured. They need to have a plan and follow a plan, even if it's a loose plan. It's rare for a judger not to have a sense of what they're doing with their time, even if it's a loose sense. Whereas perceivers, on the other hand, they have a preference for more spontaneity, more flexibility, more go with the flow. So if they have too many demands on their time, it can feel suffocating and very demoralizing to a perceiver. So that's the general idea when we talk about preference pairs. And like I said, I see mistyping happen all the time because people will go take an online assessment and the results may or may not be accurate, but they never follow up with someone who can help them verify that. So what I want to kind of just mention when we talk about these preference pairs is what you might notice first about each preference and each particular preference, right? So for an extrovert, one of the things that you might notice first for an extrovert, and especially in the work environment, is somebody who reaches understanding. They reach a place of consensus through interaction and discussion. They want to talk it through. They need to talk it through. That's how they get there. And sometimes you see this in classrooms where little kids need to think out loud and talk out loud. They have a hard time sitting down and being still or being quiet. And what saddens me is a lot of those kids get mislabeled as ADHD or having some kind of anxiety issue, when in fact they might just be extroverted and they're being forced to learn in a very intuitive environment. Introverted environment. So for example, introverts, one of the first things you might see with an introvert is somebody who, especially in the workplace, is somebody who's going to reach understanding. They're going to reach consensus by contemplating, mulling things over. They want to think about it. They might need to go away a little bit before they can come back and talk about it. So it's a very different approach to how they operate, right? And we live in a very extroverted bias world. So a lot of introverts learn to extrovert because they have to. And a lot of introverts get a lot of grief and pressure to be different, because it's like this extroverted way is the way of being. And it's not that one is good or one is bad, but if you're an introvert working in a very extroverted world or an extroverted environment, it's going to be difficult for you. You're going to have to come out of yourself to be successful. Just like an extrovert who has to work in a very introverted world or an introverted environment is also going to have to work very hard. It's going to be difficult, and they're going to have to come out of themselves as well. And I see this a lot in schools, right? Classrooms are supposed to, at least a good chunk of the day, be quiet. Introverts thrive in that. Extroverts do not. So that's one of the things you might notice first in a work or a school environment is the difference between needing to reach out and discuss and interact to get to their conclusion, whereas an introvert needs to be quieter and pull away. The next preference pair, the sensing and the intuition, one of the things you might notice first in the environment is that a sensor is going to focus first on and be much more interested in specifics, details of current or past reality. In fact, they're going to be the people that kind of notice the trees before the forest. Whereas intuitives, so folks with an intuition preference, they're going to focus on first and be most interested in the bigger picture. So global issues, future possibilities, they're going to see the forest before they see the trees. And again, depending on the work environment, the school environment, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, intuitives and sensors both get a lot of grief for not being big picture thinkers or not being able to just focus and pay attention to the details. One of the telltale signs of an intuitive is that they have a hard time remembering their spelling words. Or if they have to work really hard to memorize. They might be really good at memorizing, but they have to practice it and work very hard. Sensors just have an innate ability to remember things. For thinkers and feelers, one of the first things you might notice is that a thinker might feel a little distant or unapproachable. So they're going to typically respond first to things by asking questions and maybe even challenging a little bit about what's being said. Whereas a feeler is much more amicable, they're approachable, they are going to typically respond by looking for common ground, expressing agreement, sharing concern. They're going to find a way to connect. So again, just a different approach. And judgers and perceivers, right? One of the first things you're going to notice about them is that folks with a judging preference, they are going to have or want to plan and be really uncomfortable proceeding without some kind of structure, some kind of plan. So they're going to also use terms and vocabulary suggesting definitive result kinds of things. So they're going to use things like, well, what's the goal? What are we trying to get to here? What's the objective? What's the outcome we're looking for? Whereas a perceiver tends to kind of wait and see what's going to unfold. And they're much more comfortable proceeding and moving forward without a definitive kind of plan. So they're going to talk more generally in things like direction and movement and approach. And so depending on your preference pair and your preference type, the environments might be set up to help you thrive, or they may not. So let's talk a little bit about work styles, right? So when we think again about extroversion and introversion, work styles for each preference has to be very, very different, right? And this might be in part why certain people might struggle in certain environments, where it's employees in the work environment or children at home or children in schools. But extroverts need opportunities that they can be involved with other people from the outset of a project or assignment, whereas an introvert does not need that. They tend to prefer to work alone first. They will get others involved after they've kind of formulated their own ideas, positions. They pull away first and then come back. Very different. Extroverts, they welcome people stopping by or calling just to touch base and chat. If they had a little desk out in the middle of a warehouse where people could constantly walk by and check in, an extrovert would be thrilled. That's their sweet spot. It's not true for an introvert. An introvert experiences people who stop by or call to chat is actually an interruption. And you might get a little bark or a bite from an introvert because they're so focused inside that they have to come out and respond to the outside world. Very different. Extroverts move around a lot. They might be doing business in different places. They prefer physical space that facilitates interaction. So big wide open spaces or offices where there aren't cubes and walls. Extroverts love that. That's their sweet spot. Introverts, on the other hand, they tend to stay more to themselves. They stay in their own area. They may need to kind of go there to get their work or their business done. And they tend to prefer physical space, which allows for privacy and concentration. And that's how they thrive. So working on environments based on even just the extroversion and introversion preference can be a powerful shift in how you work with your children or your employees. In terms of work styles for the sensing and the intuitive preferences, sensors tend to work at a steady pace. They can show up to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and grind it out until 5 o'clock and go home. Intuitives cannot. They work in bursts. They often await inspiration and motivation. They might skip around and hop around, pursuing what really strikes them in the moment. That's how they need to work. They need to be able to work when they're motivated and break when they're not. A sensor, they will prefer and actually even give instructions that include both the end result and specifics about how to get there, right? So they're very concrete and very linear. Intuitives, on the other hand, they prefer and will give instructions that are much more general, indicating the end result, but not really necessarily how to get there. So there's a very different approach in terms of management and leadership, right? And taking in that information. So if you're a sensing boss and you have an intuitive employee, you might want to think about communicating in a way that the intuitive employee can understand, or vice versa. An intuitive boss with a sensor employee, or an intuitive parent with a sensing child. An intuitive parent tells a kiddo, go clean your room. A sensing kid is going to stand at their door and freeze. But if you tell that little sensor kid, go clean your room, empty out your wastebasket, and clean the mirrors, they're on it. They need very concrete and literal. A sensor, they typically work on one thing at a time, and they like to begin from and use what's already been created, already known. Whereas an intuitive, they might work on several things at different times. I'm an intuitive, and if you look at my nightstand by my bed, I've got about 8 books I'm reading all at the same time. That's very much the intuitive who works on lots of things all at once. And an intuitive likes to learn new information and new knowledge that's interesting, even if they don't really know at the moment how they're going to use it. So very different in terms of information and how they take it in and learn. The thinking and the feeling preference, work styles related to that. Thinkers, they tend to focus more on the work at hand. They don't tend to put a lot of time into building relationships or getting to know other people. Like I said, thinkers are rewarded when the job's well done. It doesn't matter how many bodies we left along the way. Whereas a feeler, that yes, they want to get the work done, but making time to get to know other people and build relationships is almost more important to a feeler than getting to the work at hand. And if you allow a feeler to do that, they are going to thrive. They will get that work done and feel good about it. Thinkers, their interactions are often very, very brief and to the point, whereas a feeler, their interactions are going to both encompass work and non-work matters. So they see a very different piece of the person when they're interacting. Thinkers tend to be naturally more critical or questioning of ideas and proposals. And they'll often make suggestions unsolicited about how to improve things. Whereas feelers, they're naturally appreciative of people's ideas and contributions. And in fact, they need to also feel appreciated. So if they work in an environment or a classroom where they're just a name or a number, there doesn't seem to have a relationship, then they're going to become very unmotivated. And in terms of the last piece of working style, according to thinking and feeling, thinkers tend to want some expectations. They want a little bit of organizational structure, whereas where this can start to look a little bit like the judging preference, it's not, it's different. They want people to make decisions. They want procedures. They want things to make sense. Whereas a feeler, They want the expectations, the organizational structure, the classroom, decisions, procedures, etc. They want it to feel right to themselves and others. So very different. Thinkers want it to make sense. Feelers want it to make feel right. And then the last preference pair, judging and perceiving. Now again, and we're talking about work styles, right? It's very, very different. Judging preferences, people with a judging preference, they tend to be more methodical, more systematic. They often develop routines pretty quickly in kind of how they approach their work. Whereas perceivers, they're more adaptable. They are often more flexible and devise innovative approaches to work. So they may not have a routine, but they still can get it done. Judgers, they like to finish things, sometimes even finishing a project or a task that's no longer necessary for the sake of closure. That's very important to a J. Whereas a perceiver likes to start things. They're motivated and interest declines when it's time to finish, right? So I have this joke, my partner and I'm a J and she's a P. And oftentimes she will start the project and I will finish the project, and it works. This is how it works. So if you have a P employee or a J employee, it's so important to build in the ability for each to work in a style that fits their preference. Folks with a judging preference, they tend to bring more structure to the work at hand. So categories, a model, checklists, and perceivers, they use approaches and processes which tend to come from experiences with the work at hand. And the last little piece that feels really important to share about the judging and perceiving preferences when it comes to work style is that judgers tend to see work and play as very distinct aspects of life. So they don't often mix work and play. And that for the most part, work and play need to stay separate. Play needs to happen outside of work. So, or at designated events. So like at a holiday party or a work picnic. Whereas perceivers, they like to mix it all together. They see work and play as intertwined pieces of life, and they want work to be not only productive, but enjoyable and playful as well. So very, very different work styles based on each of the preferences, right? And we're just talking about straight preference style. I haven't even gotten into what happens when you look at temperament or whole type, right? Because all of these mix together. And if you had that old bingo ball roller and you threw all these preference pairs in and spun it around and drew them out, you'd get 16 different types. So it's pretty easy to imagine how conflicts happen in terms of our relationships around just simply preference types. Almost up to, I would say, 75 to 80% of conflicts between parents and children, employees and bosses, leaders and team members are related to differences in personality type and can be alleviated and relieved by learning about type and how to bring that into the environment and create environments and give people opportunities and choices to thrive and find their own sweet spots. I did a little piece last week about extroversion and introversion and all the sheltering in place and how many introverts are finding it easier to do it. Not great, right? Because if you're an introverted feeler, you probably miss your friends a little bit. Extroverts might be struggling a little bit more. Sensors might be struggling a little bit more because they're used to routine, concrete, the same, whereas intuitives, they're a little more out of the box. So there's a chance that intuitives might be able to adapt to change a little bit easier. Not great, but a little easier. So huge difference in that right now happening. I hear this actually a lot right now with people from working from home, that the intuitives love it. They are so excited. They can work and work and work. And actually, they're being more productive working from home because they can work when they're motivated and they can take a break when they're not and go do something that feeds them. And then they can come back to the work when they're ready. And I'm telling you, productivity is skyrocketing right now for many intuitives. Sensors, on the other hand, they might be struggling a little bit more. They need more literal, concrete, linear kinds of processes. And, this situation, especially the change in work and school environments, is forcing every one of us to get out of the box, which is a sweet spot for the introvert, but not so much for that sensor. Feelers I think a lot of feelers are having a harder time with the quarantine and the sheltering in place than a thinker, because feelers thrive on people and connections with people. And so having that taken away from them right now is it's a difficult thing. It's throwing off a lot of feelers, whereas thinkers might be having a little bit of an easier time at home because now they don't have to worry about all those relationships. They can just get the work done. And then judging and perceivers, right? Perceivers, this is one where I kind of go back and forth, because perceivers, they tend to be more flexible and out of the box, and adapt more easily to change. It's not that judging preferences can't adapt to change. It just takes them a minute or two. But once a judging preference catches up to the change, they usually do a really good job of getting some structure in place so that they can get back on track. Whereas that's where a perceiver might struggle a little bit, is the initial newness and change is exciting, but when it comes time to sit down and actually follow the routines, that they struggle with that. So preference type, is never more prevalent, never more important than right now, when we are all out of our boxes, we are all out of our comfort zone. And so I hope that you might have heard some things today that you can take with you, or at least consider. Maybe it'll start some discussion with your employees or your children, or perhaps for those of you who management or leadership on teams, maybe it might get you thinking a little more about the environments that you require for work, because it might be beneficial to build more choice, especially in the issues and situations that we can, so that people can really find the sweet spot that thrives for them. So those are my thoughts. I've talked a very long time. I could talk all day long. It's just fascinating. I'm going to do more of these. Please drop me a comment. Let me know your thoughts. If you have questions, I'd love to hear. Aaron Zetterberg asked, "Hi, Aaron. Thanks for being here. Curious to know if other people can relate to some of these things I've talked about. I'd love to hear more from you. So drop me a comment in here, shoot me a message, shoot me an email, reach out and let me know. I plan to do more of these as well. So if there are topics or issues or things that come up that you'd like to learn more about in terms of type, please let me know that as well. And for those of you who your curiosity is piqued or you'd like to learn more, feel free to reach out. Let's talk. We can set up a time to have a short call and kind of poke around a little bit about personality type and where you might be struggling, or perhaps your team or your children are struggling. Reach out, let me know, and I appreciate you watching. And I will tell you, for those parents out there, I have, actually for anybody, because this is applicable to anybody, bosses as well, I have a free download for type tips. And so you can absolutely sign up for that. I will drop the link in the comment boxes below. But thanks for watching. As always, I am very grateful that you're part of my community. And let me know if there's any way that I can support you. Okay, bye for now.